welcome to another Design Clips here at W+9. This is Dawn Woolslegel, and in today's video we are going to be doing some very simple watercoloring. In my last video I showed you guys how to do some more advanced watercoloring featuring our Modern Floral series. Well, today we are going to get just as gorgeous an effect and end result, but we're going to be doing much simpler technique. All of the supplies I'm going to be using today are ones that you should have in your stash already. Some Tim Holtz Distress watercolor cardstock. We're going to be using the Modern Petunias stamp set, but any lined floral image will do for this. And we're going to be using the Ranger paintbrushes. These are sold in a multi-pack and come with a variety of sizes. But if you don't have these, any watercolor brush will do. You could even use an aqua painter if you have that on hand. And I'm going to be using the Gansai Tambi watercolors by Kuretake, but again, any watercolors will work with this technique. To create my vignettes, I know I'm going to need to do some masking, so I've gone ahead and cut a few of the images using the Inka Dinka Doo stamp masking paper. Now you could cut this from post-it notes if you have those on hand, those work great as well. I just happen to really like this paper. So the key when creating these more robust patterns is to start with a game plan, do a little pre-planning. Look at it as a series of layers. So here I know that my peonies, I want them to be in the foreground. So that means I want to go ahead and stamp all of those out first and mask where necessary, and then I'll come back in and add my background. I'll stamp my topmost element first, and then I'll use my mask to mask that off. I'll arrange my leaves here in that little bud. I'll pick them up on my Misti door, and then go ahead and stamp those as well. That will make the leaves and the bud be behind my peony. Now I am stamping on the smooth side of the Tim Holtz cardstock that has less texture than the other side, but if for some reason I didn't get a clean impression, since I'm using the Misti, I can re-ink and stamp again when necessary. I'm using our black ink, and that's because it is waterproof since we will be doing watercoloring. And before you get too much of your floral vignette stamped, it's a good idea to stop and make sure that the sentiment you've chosen will fit. Make sure that you leave enough room that your stamping won't interfere with the legibility of the sentiment itself. And I'm not going to stamp it just yet, I'm just making sure to leave enough room because I do want to watercolor the entire background. And the Gansai Tambi, some of the colors do leave like a chalky film, which would show up over the stamping, so I'm going to save that for last. I've got my first layer of stamping done, and I've picked out my color palette. I'm using number 43, number 139, number 57, and number 20. Number 20 is black, but I've diluted it a lot so that it's just gray. And I'll show you here in just a sec how I dilute all of these colors. I rarely ever pull them straight out of the pan. I always reconstitute them first by spritzing them with water, and then I pull the color over to an acrylic block. The Gansai Tambi are very concentrated, so I usually pull them off onto an acrylic block and then pick up from there to do my painting. This way I can control how intense my color is. And that's important here because we're going to be working in layers. So our very first layer is going to be our lightest wash of color. So when we create our mix, we're going to use lots of water, little bit of pigment. The more water you add, the lighter or less intense your color will be, and the more pigment you add, the more deep or intense that color will be. So we're going to start by covering all of our petals with this light yellow, and I'm not being careful. This is in real speed. You can see I'm just covering the petals with this first wash of color. Some areas I will leave white. I believe I chose to leave anywhere the petals were turning over. I left them white. I left them unpainted so that white would become my highlight. And then once you're done adding all of your color to the petals, you'll let that dry, and then we're going to move on to the leaves. We're going to use the same technique on our leaves. And the fun thing about this style is that you don't have to be perfect. A lot of areas I'm not even going all the way to the outer line here. I'm leaving some white gaps and edges. It's just a little more playful. It's not loose or sloppy. It's just a little more casual. And once all the leaves are done and the first layer of my peonies are dry, I'll come in and I'll add a second layer. This is going to be like my mid-tone. So I've added a little more pigment to my mixture there, and I'm going to start dropping it into the middle and then adding that second layer to all of my petals on my peonies. So for this layer, I'm not going to go all the way out to the edges. I'm going to add deeper areas of color, but I'm going to allow an edge of that lighter, that first layer that we laid down, I'm going to allow that to show. So I'm just adding it more close to the base of the petal. and leaving the very edge that light first wash of color. I'll continue to do this all the way around, and then I'll do the same thing to the other peony. And then come in and do the second layer of the leaves. Now I only do 2 layers of color on the leaves, but on the peonies I will do a 3rd layer. But I'll just go around and add just a little extra wash of color to all of my leaves. And again, I'm leaving a lot of that first layer showing. This is just to add a little bit of interest. I just continued my way around and finished up all of the remaining leaves. And then once those are done, I can come in and add my 3rd and final layer to my peonies. For this 3rd round, I want it to be a little more muted. So I'm going to take that yellow and I'm going to add its complementary color, which is purple. So I'm just going to add a touch of that to this yellow, and it's what we call graying it down. It just pushes it a little toward brown and mutes down the vibrancy of that yellow. For the 3rd layer, I'm going to add even less color, and I'm going to be putting it closer to the petals. Again, I'm not overthinking it. I'm just adding a little bit of that color. I'm leaving the hard edges so that there is a very definitive difference between each of the colors, each layer of color. So you'll be able to distinctly see the darker, the mid, and then the very light, our initial first wash of color. This is a great painting style for those that are maybe new to watercolor or intimidated by some of these more detailed line images, because it's a great way to acquaint yourself with how the watercolor works, how it moves, how it behaves. And if you're using a less detailed style, your expectations are not going to be perfection. You're just going for the feel or maybe the movement. So it's a great one to practice, or just to kind of dip your toes into some of these more intricate images without having the stress of making them perfect. Let's face it, perfection is boring. I would much rather have something interesting than something that is accurate or perfect or conventionally beautiful. I don't know. It takes something that's conventionally beautiful and boring, and I have no use for it. You can take something that's not conventionally beautiful but is super interesting, and that's the stuff that I'm gonna buy. That's the stuff that I want to create, because it just has more longevity. It's just not eye candy. And let's face it, these are just cards. They're just paper. So don't stress yourself out and don't limit yourself. If you see something that you like and you want to try it, go for it. If you want to try to illustrate. If you want to try to paint. It really is all about the process more than the end result. And you guys, if I've said it once, I've said it a million times. For me, it is never about the end result. It is always about the process. As long as you're having fun, that's all that matters. Okay, and I guess that was my PSA of the day. Let's get back to this card before it turns into a 20-minute video. Now we're going to come in and put in the background. And for that, I'm using that black, which again, I've added a lot of water to and made it into a very light gray. And I'm just going to fill in the entire background. I'm using a flat brush to do this because it's going to cover more area. If you want to use a larger flat brush, you could do that. You would end up with less brush strokes in your paint. However, I don't mind it in this particular card because it will just mimic the style of the flowers. So for me, it's not a big deal. Once I had the entire background covered, I set it aside to dry, and then I can come in and do my stamping. Now this part is optional. You could stop right here, put your sentiment, and be done. But I wanted to add some more interest to this card because it's all about the interest. I want it to be tone on tone. So I'm using our fairy dust ink, which is a light gray ink, but it's going to still show up over this watercolored background. It's just going to give it a tonal effect. I've masked off any areas that I don't want to stamp through or over, and I'm going to concentrate these around the outer edges to give me that vignette effect. And I've made sure to leave bare space where my sentiment is going to go. So I liked where this was going, but it still felt like it needed something. It felt a little too contrived. So I needed to break it up or to add a supporting image. So I dug through my stash and I found this berry image from our Botanical Bunch stamp set, and I'm going to stamp that mostly around the edges with a few added into the peony bunches. However, I want to make sure that I don't stamp anywhere that it's going to interfere with the sentiment. Remember, we're stamping this in black. Our sentiment is also going to be in black, so I don't want to mess up the legibility of my sentiment. So I'm laying that down for placement, and then I'm going to mask off anything that I want to stay in the front because I don't want it to stamp on top of it. And then I'm going to add in a few of these berry images throughout my background and then around the edges. And I like that so much better. So now I'm going to stamp my sentiment, and for that I'm using the mini misti along with a transparency grid here. I don't know why I waited so long to buy one of these. It's quite useful. I'm going to use that same Pure Color dye ink in black to stamp my sentiment, and then all I have to do is color in those berries. So for that I'm going to use that purple that we picked out, and again I'm not being very careful with these. I'm purposely going outside of the lines on some of them, and we're only going to be doing one layer of color on these. So some of them I made darker or deeper in color, and then some of them I used a much more diluted wash on. Just wanted to keep that same playfulness that the rest of the card has. And there you have a gorgeous dimensional floral vignette with only one layer. I loved it so much I made several versions. For this one I used traditional color palette, and on the leaves in the background I used our hayride to get that tone on tone effect and mounted it on craft card base. Here, the one we just created, I mounted on a dove gray top folding card base, and I loved the color palette so much that I made another version, and I just switched up where I put the colors. For the background on this one, I stamped those leaves in our lake house, which gave this beautiful blue tone on tone, and mounted that on a black top folding card base. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Remember, you can find all of the featured W+9 supplies at W+9.com, and be sure to check the description box below for links to our blog post where you can find more stills on this project, as well as a full supply list with links. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and I will see you next time. Bye!